Um, if all of our speakers today could turn on their cameras right now, that'd be fantastic. And I just wanted to welcome everyone to the first ever Scholars for Society webinar. My name is Rohan Parikh, and I am the treasurer for Scholars for Society. And I'll be hosting the webinar along with our executive director, Justin Lee.
Hey everyone, my name's Justin. I'm the Executive Director of Scholars Society. We can't wait for y'all to learn about our speakers and the interesting concepts that they're going to teach. Before we get started, I just want to talk a little bit about our organization. So Scholars for Society is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that seeks to educate students and the public about pressing issues that face humanity while teaching important STEM and humanities concepts. We plan and host many events, including competitions, webinars such as this one, and other in-person activities.
Yeah, so
yeah, we're just continuing to admit people, and then we're going to get started soon.
yeah, so kind of building off of what Justin said. We're just gonna wait on some people to come, and then we'll get started. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. So some of the speakers that we have today are gonna be Oscar Horta, Silvio Amir, Heather Sheardown, Saeed Amal, and Katriel Friedman. And they're gonna go ahead and introduce themselves in order, starting with Oscar Horta.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. Yeah, so I am a philosopher at the University of Santiago de Compostela in Spain, and in addition to that, I'm the co-founder of Animal Ethics, which is an international organization working on long-termism and other issues, including wild animal suffering related to animals. Do you want me to go ahead with the presentation, or?
Oh, I guess next we could have, we're just going in order of like the speaking order. So Silvio, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. Hi everyone. My name is Silvio Amir. I'm an assistant professor of computer science at the Northeastern University. I work in NLP and machine learning, specifically applied to personal data, such as social media and electronic health records, specifically clinical notes. And broadly, I'm interested in improving the performance, obviously, but also the fairness and the interpretability of NLP and machine learning models applied to personal data. Do you want me to give a little peek into what I'm going to talk about, or?
I think we can just go ahead with brief introductions. You could give like an, yeah, we sent out the like overview to most of the participants. So next, I guess we can go to Dr. Sheardown.
Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Sheardown. I'm a professor in the Department of Chemical Engineering at McMaster University, which is in Hamilton, Ontario, located halfway between Toronto and Buffalo. So most people don't know where Hamilton is. And my expertise is ophthalmic biomaterials. So I'm a chemical engineer by training, but my research and my interests are all in ocular materials for treating a whole host of different conditions.
Next, we can go on to Saeed.
Hi, so I'm Saeed Amal. I'm assistant research professor at Northeastern University as part of the Roux Institute. And I was, before that, I was a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford School of Medicine. I'm mainly focusing on the use of artificial intelligence and multimodal data for improving cardiovascular disease care. So before joining the academia, I've been in the industry for a long time as a research scientist and as advisor for companies like General Motors with the autonomous vehicles and General Electric for the acute care division. And I helped many startups for employing artificial intelligence in their products. I've been in the tech industry since 2005, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. So lastly, we can have Katriel introduce himself.
Thanks so much for having me, Justin. It's an honor to be on such an erudite panel, a lot of professors, of which I am not one. I work at the World Bank, which lends money to and grants money to developing countries to invest in all sorts of aspects of their public services and economy. I work on health and nutrition in the Middle East and North Africa. And I once spent a couple of years running a nonprofit promoting vaccination across India. Back over to you.
Yeah, that sounds great, Katriel. Just as a reminder to all of our participants, we will have a questions and answer section at the end. So if time permits, save your questions until then, and then you're going to type them in the chat at the very end of the session. So we hope y'all enjoy. And with that being said, let's let our speakers take it away, starting with Oscar Horta.
Oscar, I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. So I understand we have very little time because we have like 15 minutes each, including questions. I don't know if we are gonna take questions from the public or not. You want us to take questions? Yeah.
We can, if we have time at the end, we can. Just go ahead and present your entire presentation.
All right. Yeah. Well, so let's go then. Yeah. So because we have very little time, I'm gonna just rush and tell you the essential, and I'm not gonna get into anything technical. So I prepared this presentation with just pictures and very easy, extremely easy, accessible stuff, just to tell you what this really is about. So basically, yeah, there was some problem, I think, with the presentation. I'll try again. Yeah, so basically, all around the world, there are different projects aiming at reducing wild animal suffering. So they include, for instance, protocols for rescuing or preventing harms to animals when extreme weather events take place or natural disasters. They also include providing shelter or, for instance, artificial housing or actually artificial burrows for animals. Also, healthcare is provided to wild animals in many different situations. And let me clarify that by wild animals, I'm not meaning just those who live there, maybe out there in national parks and whatnot, but also those that live in urban environments or agricultural areas very close to humans, that is so-called synanthropic animals. Then there are also other projects, like for instance, contraception projects that are typically implemented because we don't want these animals to, be too numerous because maybe they can be a nuisance, or so we consider. But this is also very useful for them because this can allow us to help them in other ways. For instance, if they are starving animals and you provide them food, maybe next year you'll have the same problem or bigger. But if you combine this with contraception, you help them while avoiding future problems. Then another way of helping animals that is done mostly for anthropocentric reasons, but that it's very positive for them, is vaccination. Wild animal vaccination programs have been, going on for several decades already against diseases like, as you can see in that paper, tuberculosis, or for instance, rabies, and all these programs are very useful and very important for animals because while many people have an idyllic view of nature, in fact, what happens is that the vast majority of animals have lives that contain, at some point or another, significant forms of suffering, and they often die, sometimes shortly after coming into existence, and due to factors such as I said before, extreme weather events, diseases, parasitism, hunger, accidents, conflicts, etc. And to get an idea of the extent that this has, we may think that this may happen just in a minority of cases. But what happens is that when we look at the way in which animals typically reproduce in nature, what we found out is that the vast majority of them reproducing by having very, very large numbers of offspring. So for instance, a frog like this one may lay thousands or maybe 10,000 eggs. And on average, on stable populations, only one animal per parent will reach maturity. So the rest of them will die, often shortly after coming into existence, often in painful ways. And because their lives are so short, they don't have time to have any positive experiences, due to which, if we can help animals, it can be very important. It can make a significant difference. So we can see that the scale of the problem really is very large. And this is a problem that, while I presented these examples of ways in which animals are helped, nevertheless, is still fairly neglected. Some people claim, well, what happens with these animals is that maybe they are not sentient, but it seems odd to claim that these animals aren't sentient, even those, like the one you see in the picture, that just got into existence a short time ago. So this means that when it comes to advocacy, there are different ways that people interested in making the world a better place can do, like incorporate wild animals in our message about how to improve things, engage also in widely supported campaigns for helping animals, like the ones I mentioned before. Then for research, there is an open field out there. So in natural science, we can study how to assess the welfare of wild animals, what are natural factors affecting them. In social science, we can study the attitudes toward helping wild animals and how to communicate best to the general public. And in law and politics, we can also study the ways to promote change. Animal Ethics, the organization I work with, and recently, well, actually not recently, a couple of years ago, did a study among scholars and students evaluating the attitudes towards this. And we found out that unlike what many people still think, there is a significant support for all this, especially when it comes to helping urban animals, to wild animal vaccination programs. And we may think, vaccination programs, this is not a science fiction thing. As I said before, this has been done for decades. And it's not that people go there vaccinating animals one by one. You may use oral bait that you drop from the air, for instance, in helicopters. And in this way, diseases like rabies have been eradicated for large areas in North America and in Europe. So that would be it. I really rushed because I wanted to explain the whole thing in just a few minutes. If any of you wants to do some more research on this, I would recommend you take a look at our website. It's, by the way, available in many different languages. I think we have like 10 languages, including not just English, but also like Chinese, Hindi, Spanish, French, German, and others. You can also take a look at our YouTube channel, where you can find videos explaining all this in much more detail. Or in the particular case of wild animal suffering, you can also download this ebook, which is available in our website. Or else, this is a book that I recently published this year. You can also take a look at that. And yeah, that will be it. So yeah, I hope I made it on time. I think I did. I don't know if there is time for maybe one question or two now, or otherwise we just leave it for the next speaker.
Yeah, thank you so much. We'll do questions at the end. So if anyone has any questions over Professor Horta's presentation or any presentation, can feel free to message it to either me or Rohan, and then we'll address those at the end. But thank you so much. I think it's interesting how like people completely ignore the suffering of these wild animals, but it's equally as important as to humans. So with regard to these important impacts, Silvio, Amir will be talking about an advancement with profound implications of machine learning. So take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much. Let me see if I can share my screen. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, is it visible?
I'm able to see it, yes.
I apologize. Yes. Looks like I cannot see it. Okay. Okay, can you guys see it?
Yes.
All right. So, all right, sorry for this technical challenge here. So yeah, I'm going to talk about personalization and natural language processing. But I would like to, obviously, like Oscar, I don't think I can make justice to this field in such a short period of time, and without really knowing what is the technical background of the audience. But I would like to just talk briefly about deep learning and how it's changing the paradigm and how we think about and how we build machine learning and NLP models. Then I'm going to talk about some of the harms that can arise from applying machine learning and NLP to personal data. And by bias, and for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to define bias simply as the differences in predictive performance with respect to specific groups. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing in my lab to kind of mitigate or at least control for these issues. And so, in recent years, deep learning has completely revolutionized the fields of AI and machine learning by leveraging large data sets and a lot of compute, especially with the emergence of GPUs and TPUs. These models can learn, these techniques can yield really powerful models without the need for manually designed features that rely on domain expertise. And so this convergence of data and compute allowed first old models to perform much better, and even to perform new and more complex tasks. For example, here on the left, we can see a neural network proposed by Yann LeCun in the end of the 90s to recognize hand digits. And kind of the same type of model now scaled up and also with some new advances, methodological advances, but these fundamentally the same type of model can now recognize multiple objects in the scene, not only detect, but also recognize what types of objects in real time. So this scale also allowed for new architectures that can be scaled up to billions of parameters and can be pre-trained or can be trained on internet scale data sets. And one important advance is that these models can now be pre-trained using what we call self-supervised learning, where the idea is that we can leverage natural sources of supervision and unlabeled data and raw data that allow the model to kind of learn general representations. And these self-supervised objectives can be things like, I give you a sentence and you have to predict the next words, or you give it a sentence, you mask some of the words and you ask the model to predict the missing words. And these sorts of techniques combined with the large scale can lead to even emergent abilities, things that the model was not necessarily trained for, but it kind of emerge. And I'm going to talk about some of these emergent abilities a little bit, now. So one of the implications of this is that we are now moving from a paradigm where we needed large amounts of labeled data to train these models to do what we call supervised learning. And now we are able to leverage these large unlabeled data sets and use self-supervised learning to kind of pre-train the models. And this then allows us to derive task-specific models by fine-tuning with smaller amounts of these manually labeled data. We are now, and this happened in the last 5 years or so, and we are now kind of moving slowly away from this paradigm where we can train even larger models with even larger data sets in this kind of self-supervised scheme. And then just showing these models one or a handful of examples, we can then ask the model to make predictions on the basis of those. And at the same time that we are seeing this rapid rise in the abilities of machine learning models, we are seeing that these models are increasingly being used to make predictions with respect to specific individuals. And these predictions are being made in several fields, like the medical field, financial field, legal and criminal fields. And the problem is that these models can encode biases. And for example, there is this Joy Bullwimi is this researcher. She was at the MIT Media Lab when she found that a commercial computer vision application that was supposed to recognize faces was not able to detect her face, but yet it performed fairly well for her white colleagues. And so upon systematic investigation of this, she found that these models would perform worse for males, for females than males, and would perform much worse for Black people than white people. And it turns out that the reason is that these models would perform poorly for underrepresented groups because they were these groups were not included in the training sets, and therefore the models had no ability to learn specific patterns that are characteristic of those groups. And furthermore, if we even if we have the ability to have sufficient data for underrepresented groups, we still run the risk, since we are training models on the basis of historical data, we run the risk of, and if this historical data reflects differential treatments and biases in these systems, it may so happen that these models learn to perpetuate or even kind of amplify these prevailing biases. And it turns out that it's not enough to just say remove say demographic attributes such as race, an explicit indicator of race, for example, because these models can learn correlations from even apparently harmful features or pieces of information, such as, for example, zip codes that are widely correlated with demographic groups. We see that in clinic NLP, we found, and some colleagues of mine have found that even the choice of words by nurses and physicians in clinical notes can be predictive of race. even if we strip these nodes of explicit indicators of race. And it turns out that these models end up learning these potentially harmful associations. And so the figure on the top right shows that if we ask a model to predict the race given a clinical node, such as the one in the figure, and the model may predict, or the model actually predicted that the patient was Black. But if we slightly modify the note by adding words such as loving and caring, the model all of a sudden predicts that the patient is white. In the bottom figure on the right, this is an example of a large pre-trained model using the self-supervised approaches that I was mentioning, that given a prompt where the model has to predict the missing words, the model will predict that a Caucasian patient that became violent should be sent to the hospital, but an African-American patient that became violent should be sent to prison. In my own work, I also found that if we were to fine-tune some of these large pre-trained models to make clinical predictions, simply by changing the random seeds that are used to kind of initialize these models, just by virtue of these random seeds, the models, the resulting models end up having significantly large variance in the performance. And it turns out that this variance is even larger for underrepresented groups, right? And this means that if we were to deploy one such model, just depending on the random seed, we could incur higher or lower levels of disparity. And so one of the reasons why this is problematic is because these large models have the capacity to encode a lot of concepts and associations, but they tend to encode these associations implicitly. And so my hypothesis is that if we build these personalized NLP models by explicitly accounting for group membership information, such as demographics, we can, to a certain extent, mitigate or at least control for these group biases. This in turn would allow, say, practitioners to decide whether and when to include these sensitive information, would allow also for practitioners to audit these models and even generate, say, counterfactual predictions. Things like, if the model makes a prediction for a given patient, we can say, like, suppose now that this patient, is a female rather than a male, or suppose this patient is Black rather than white, and see how this changes the model's predictions. And this can also help to enable both auditing and also provide a means for recourse for a given patient that was potentially negatively affected by the predictions of a given model. And so along these lines, I am looking at variants of these transformer architectures that have group-specific parameters, and that, by leveraging these group-specific parameters, we hope that those end up encoding these group-specific characteristics and allow then the models to kind of tailor their predictions on the basis of these. And at the same time, we can remove these information if it's deemed not important or that should not be relevant for a given task. Another thing that I'm looking at more recently with my student is to see whether these models that learn, that can make predictions without really training them with task-specific data, simply by prompting, whether these models can, first we're looking at whether these models can also predict race from nodes. And we found a couple of examples where that is the case. This is kind of early work. We are now running experiments to systematically measure the ability of these models to predict race and gender. we can see that for at least for a couple of examples, the model is indeed able to predict these attributes. The question is whether the models will be using this information implicitly to make medical decisions, and we are interested in seeing whether these types of models also have the potential to incur biases. So if they do, as of now, I'm not really sure how we can address this, but yeah, this is kind of the work we are doing to try to control for, or at least mitigate these issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Amir, for giving us this insight into machine learning in like the healthcare system. On the other hand, Professor Sheardown will be talking about engineering in the healthcare system. So please go ahead.
I think you're muted.
Can you see my presentation? Sorry about that. Okay.
Yes, we're able to see it.
And can you see it? There we go, full screen. All right. So I'm just going to talk about engineering and its impact in the healthcare system. So I often tell my students that we're in the middle of what we consider the biological century.
I think we lost you.
If you think about all of the things that have happened, can you hear me? Okay. If you think about all of the things that have happened in the last 15 to 20 years, and the pandemic not even being a small piece of them, you know, you think about all the changes that biology will make. So mapping the genome, cloning a sheep, for example, but also more on the biomolecular level, right? Understanding interactions between cells and diseases. I mean, RNA vaccines, if you had looked back in 1999, you would never thought that we would have vaccines made of RNA. So when you take a traditional view of engineering, this is what you think about. You think about bridges and cars and polymer processing machinery and even waste and recycling, but also gas and all of that kind of stuff. But what I would propose is that engineering really is all about medicine. So if you think about all of the systems in our bodies, they really have engineering at their heart, pun intended. So the heart pumps blood to the body. It's really just a pump. Blood vessels are really just special tubes that carry blood around. So, you know, if we want to pump something from one place to another, we put it through a pipe. The liver has both chemical reactor functions and waste disposal functions, all things that engineers do. The kidneys act as filters, they do separations. The skin even is just a protective barrier, and you can go on and on and on and on. So the idea is that we've created this new field, this relatively new field of bioengineering, where we take these biological systems and try and apply engineering knowledge and engineering applications to them to produce better healthcare systems, cleaner energy. So biodiesel, for example, we want to clean up the environment and all kinds of things. So the challenge for us as bioengineers and biomedical engineers is, how do we make our engineered products work as well, or be as have the same longevity as the biological unit they're mimicking. So if you look at a pump, take a pump off the shelf, and if we were to just, you know, if we had the perfect pump, there was no other problems, and we put it into a person's body, would that pump be able to pump 72 times per minute for 80 to 90 years without a single failure, right? Because that's what our hearts do. And then it's able to feedback control. So if it needs a little bit more blood, then the heart pumps a little faster. And it's naturally lubricated. So, you know, we don't have to go in and add oil to our pumps. I mean, I know that my students in the lab our freeze dryer pumps are constantly being lubricated. So if you think about the body, it's really an amazing engineered system. And how do we do better things with it to make it work? Our engineered products work. So my lab works in two areas, and I'm going to talk more about one than the other. The first one is regenerative medicine, where we're actually trying to grow new organs and tissues. But the second one is all about materials. So how do we create better materials that function as a heart or as a liver or as a kidney? And that last as long, but also have the same interactions with the body. So, and biomaterials kind of cross both, which is why that's an important thing. So if you think about all of the biomaterials that are used in healthcare, the number is huge. I mean, because I work in the eye, obviously intraocular lenses and contact lenses are two of my favorite things, and I'm going to talk about those a little bit more. But just the numbers of biomaterials-based devices that are used. But the problem is they're good, but they're not perfect. There's lots of problems with them. So how do we make them better? And that's a lot of the stuff that my lab does. So we want our biomaterials to fulfill the requirements of the material in the body. So it needs to have a whole host of different things, right? It needs to have the right physical properties, and that's usually where we start. So engineering properties like strength, toughness, elasticity, creep, those kinds of things. And then chemical properties. So chemically, how does it interact with the body? How does it, is it stable? Does it sterilize okay? And then engineers are always worried about manufacturing. So can we manufacture it? Can we manufacture it on a line that allows for it to be manufactured at scale, or do we have to do something very special to make it happen? And then the most important thing is it biocompatible? And the definition of biocompatibility really varies with where the materials are going. So my favorite thing to talk about, it's funny, I love talking about the eye. And I've had to do presentations recently that weren't on the eye, and it makes me sad to not talk about the eye. So ocular environment, we all know that the population is aging. There's lots of opportunities for us to treat new diseases. And what we want to be able to do is treat these diseases more efficiently. So if we look at the anatomy of the eye, and I've actually got two slides here, because as small as the eye is, it has both a posterior and an anterior segment. So the anterior segment, the front of the eye, consists of everything from the lens forward. So the cornea, the lens, there's an area in there that basically holds a fluid. And then there's lots of things that can go wrong with that section of the eye. And then the posterior of the eye is everything behind the lens. So kind of the business end of us seeing, right? The light gets focused on the retina. We've probably all heard of macular degeneration. The optic nerve is what happens, what is damaged when we've got glaucoma. And then again, this is all within a fluid-filled body called the vitreous chamber. So I'm going to talk about a couple of applications of biomaterials in the eye, all areas that we've worked on. I'm not going to give you any specifics, but try to make it real. So contact lenses, right? I'm sure that there are people in the audience that are wearing contact lenses. There are about 100 million contact lens wearers worldwide. And this is actually only a small fraction of the people that could wear contact lenses. So one of the things the contact lens companies are interested in is, how do we make contact lenses better? And one of the things that they came up with as a result of what they perceived as the need, and this is very much an engineering development, was something called silicone hydrogel contact lenses. So these are the newest type of lenses. They've been around for about 20 years. And what they combine is the properties of all of those nice materials that we wore back in the 90s. They were comfortable, they had lots of water, so they felt like they were tissue going on the eye, with a silicone phase that allows for oxygen to pass through. Because if you look at your eye, there are no blood vessels. Can't see blood vessels. You can only see transparency. And what that means is that there's no way to feed the tissues. So our eye is fed by the oxygen that comes from the air. And so what the hypothesis was that, well, maybe if we feed the eye better with oxygen, maybe the materials will be more comfortable. And so some very smart people at two contact lens companies, Ciba Vision and Bausch and Lomb, kind of in parallel developed these silicone materials. So combining a very hydrophobic material, silicone, think bathtub caulking, right? We want to keep water out. And hydrophilic materials, think Jello, because that's what essentially contact lenses were made of before, and combining them together in some way. And we all know that oil and water don't go together well. So how do we engineer this so that we've got these two materials together? And then what they discovered was that you actually need to have continuous phases from one side to the other of both of the materials. So almost like a little roadway from the front to the back of the eye. If you want oxygen to get from the front of the eye to the back of the eye, you need to have a roadway, a path for it to get through. So the silicone phases have to be connected, but you also want to be able to have water pumped from the front to the back. So you need that hydrophilic, that Jello-like phase to also be continuous. And these materials have been really successful, but they haven't solved the comfort problem. So, where are we now? We're looking at, well, is it a surface thing? What's the problem with these materials? How do we make them better? So ocular health is great, but people are still complaining that at the end of the day, their contact lenses feel dry and uncomfortable. So one of my favorite stories is about intraocular lenses. Really cool story. There's tons of intraocular lenses implanted annually around the world. And it doesn't matter in whether it's developed or developing countries, IOL surgery, cataract surgery is very common. So cataracts, leading cause of blindness worldwide, but relatively easily treated. So what happens is the lens is a series of fibers. So it's mainly non-cellular tissue that on the surface has epithelial cells. And if you look at what the lens does, this was a student of mine who was a big Montreal Canadiens fan. So anybody who understands hockey will know that. What the lens is able to do is it's able to move as a result of wanting to look off in the distance or wanting to look close. And so the idea is that we want our lens that we put in to replace whatever we're taking out, the damaged lens, the one that has a cataract where the fibers have become not transparent. We want to be able to have it be able to do the same accommodation. So it was first discovered that these materials could be implanted and could restore the power of the eye, the focusing of the eye, by a doctor during the Second World War. And what he noticed was that pilots who came into the OR that had had their windscreens cracked and had little pieces of the windscreen in their eye, they didn't have any kind of inflammation, they didn't have any problems. So, he looked at, gee, this is a good material from a biocompatibility standpoint. The material that he implanted is essentially a hard plastic. So your fish tank that you might have at home, it's that plastic. It's polymethyl methacrylate. So you can imagine that was a very complicated surgery, but it worked. It worked very well. So since then, engineers have developed a whole series of materials that allow for these things to go in relatively non-invasively. Kind of the size of the injector is, a 20 gauge needle. So a big needle, but not huge. And the surgery can be done in about 15 minutes. So things that we're trying to look at is, can we change the power of the lens, the optics of the lens after it's implanted? Or can we, for example, change the accommodation? So make it so that the lens is able to look close, person is reading, and then they look up and they look far away and they can see something that's off in the distance. And then I just want to spend a couple minutes on delivery, because this is an area that my lab spends a whole lot of time. So most of the drugs that are delivered to the eye, I can't seem to get to the next slide for some reason. There we go. Most of the drugs that are delivered to the eye are delivered by eye drops. And if anyone has put eye drops in their eye, I'm sure that most of us have. It's a pain. We don't like it. Nobody likes it. Kids don't like it. Most of it spills onto your eye. And what this means is that patient compliance, people actually doing what they're supposed to do, is very poor. So what we've been looking at is how do we make it better? And one of the things that my lab has developed is what we would see as a better eye drop. So we've encapsulated the drug into a little polymer packet that essentially sticks on the surface of the eye. So instead of the drug staying on the eye for about 5 minutes, we've shown that it can stay on the eye for 4 to 5 days. So the idea is that we can deliver less drug, or we can deliver it less frequently, which is really important for elderly patients who have to put drugs in their eye, you know, 2 or 3 times a day. And then in the back of the eye, there's a huge need for things that would allow us to deliver drugs over a longer period of time. So right now, the status of care is that we inject into the eye about once a month. So you can imagine that people just love going and having injections into the back of their eye, right? You know, I'm going to sign up for that tomorrow. So how do we make it so that we can engineer a solution that would allow us to maybe have to go in once every 6 months, once every year, once every 2 years? And again, we've looked at kind of the toolbox of materials that we have, and we're playing around right now with a material that has in situ gelling properties. So it goes in as a liquid, it injects, it forms a solid, and then the drug comes out slowly over a period of time, presumably over 6 months, but we're not quite there yet. So, you know, just I think that there's huge potential for engineering to make real inroads into how we treat diseases, and understanding kind of the biology versus the engineering will lead to all kinds of really cool treatments for the future. Right, let me just stop sharing.
Thank you so much. So next we can go on to Saeed Amal's presentation about the use of artificial intelligence for cardiovascular disease.
Okay, so first, in general, what we do in my lab is trying to predict adverse events that happens during cardiothoracic surgery. So for this, we use the multimodal data with artificial intelligence. As example, modeling the time series data of like ECG and other modalities like textual modalities by modeling using natural language processing, vital signs. So this is the high-level theme research that we do in my lab. Today, I chose to talk about one research that I published recently. So it's about artificial intelligence for automatic detection of peripheral artery disease using electronic health record data. Okay, so about peripheral artery disease, it's a common circulatory problem where what happens is that the blood, the arteries are get narrowed, and the blood flow to the limbs is reduced, and it's one of the common cardiovascular disorder that is undiagnosed. These are one of the challenges because it's typical symptoms are not reported by patient. So the typical symptoms can be pain in leg or hip when walking, pain in arms, or leg numbness, as example. And the PAD affects 8 to 12 million American adults. and more than 200 million worldwide. So the limitations of the current models and algorithms that are being used are that they use classic risk factors using regression models, which would limit their feature modeling to demographic data, laboratory data, and comorbidity data. As example, what disease can happen with this for patient that has this specific disease. So it doesn't, so these current models doesn't take into consideration the disease trajectory, where lifestyle, as example of the patient, and biological factors as genetics were not modeled. So additional limitation is the lack of implementation. And on a survey with primary physicians, 68% of them didn't measure the ABI, the ankle bronchial indices, which is one of the most predictive parameters for this peripheral artery disease. And although 89% of them believe that this parameter is useful for the PAD diagnosis, and according to the survey, they didn't do this measurement because of lack of time, lack of staff, and lack of financial reimbursement. So, and in general, the challenges for the diagnosis of this PAD, peripheral artery disease, are that only 10 to 30% of the patients report typical symptoms of the disease, and the awareness of the patients. So 25% of surveyed adults only demonstrated awareness of this disease. So our goal was in this specific research was to use electronic health record, including textual data and including diagnosis of other disease and vital signs for the improving the ability to automatically detect the peripheral artery disease using artificial intelligence, machine learning, and deep learning techniques. And we, as I mentioned, we would like to model the lifestyle factors and the biological factors of the patients. So in a very brief way, I will explain that the existing research are based mainly on risk factors that are currently being used by the physicians. As example, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, diabetes, coronary artery disease, cerebrovascular disease, and other disease. That what happens is that today the caregivers, the physicians, use these diseases to try and diagnose the patients. And the current work research that existed before our research was using logistic regression that takes these parameters as input and try to detect whether whether this patient has a PAD or not. And part of these parameters require significant effort, as example, the hypertension or diabetes. And still these models had modest performance as 0.6 area under the curve score. Other models try to use NLP by having rules of what concepts that describe the PAD were existing in the electronic health records, and they report that their models were able to achieve accuracy of 81.8%. So I'll talk a little bit about the cohort characteristics that we had in our studies. So approximately 70% of our cohort was Caucasian. 60% of the PED patients were male, and 40% of the controls that those are the patients that didn't have the PAD were male. And then we found that the PAD patient had a higher burden of comorbidities. As example, 44% of the PAD cases had history of cerebrovascular disease. 72% of them had coronary artery disease. So, and some other also more frequent disease that happen, that patient of PAD has these disease as heart failure, hypertension, diabetes. So what we try to do is to use multiple types of machine learning and deep learning models to try and improve the existing state-of-the-art achievements. So in this case, we wanted to have a baseline. And for this baseline, we took the traditional risk factors that are being used today by the physicians, and we modeled them using logistic regression algorithm. Additional algorithm that we developed for using electronic health record for evaluating how these electronic health record information would help in improving the capabilities of diagnosing PAD patients. So we use random forest, which is ensemble learning model that uses multiple, in this case, multiple trees, and then vote which, according to the performance of these multiple models, and take the decision. Additional models that we use are deep learning models, as example, the recurrent neural networks, which are known for their ability to model sequential data. Since a patient, since we need to model the historical data, the visits of the patient, we needed to have a model that can take into consideration these sequential data. So for and as I mentioned, for accurate prediction, we need to model the trajectory of the patient, the care journey of the patient, by using information that appeared in the electronic health records during the visits. So in visits, the doctor can diagnose as the patient had diabetes, or can report that the patient is a heavy smoker, as example. And on each one of these visits, we have the information that might affect the specific cardiovascular disease that we are trying to predict. So in this case, we use recurrent neural networks. Since recurrent neural networks, the simple implementation tends to forget in long sequences because of the problem of vanishing gradient. So we used a variation of RNN, which is long short-term memory. And in this case, we were able to model longer sequences of the data, which made our model more predictive. So we model information over time. So I will skip to the next architecture where I show. So this is the architecture that we used. So one component on the left, we can see the component that models the sequential data. As example, we have on each one of these visits, we took the age of the patient on the visit time. We took the recency, which is the distance in time from the date that we are performing the diagnosis, and the type of concepts and the concept IDs. So the concept, in Stanford, we had like a system that models each one of the disease, each one of the concepts that were mentioned in the electronic health records. So we have the type of the concept and the concept itself. and other information that we want to model, which is the component appearing on the right, where we use the fully connected neural networks for modeling the current age of the patient on the time of the test or on the diagnosis, the race, the gender, and in this case we took also the average number of codes, because it kind of give the measure of how long have this patient coming to visit the doctor. And then we had, in this case, we made this problem as binary classification problem, since we would decide whether the patient had a PAD or doesn't have PAD, peripheral artery disease. So in this case, we performed a five-fold cross validation, and we can see here that we were able to achieve a very impressive AUC compared to the existing algorithms, because we were able to use, we had large data set, and we were able to use the deep learning models that can model the journey of the patient, the visits of the patient. And we can see here, we compare here multiple folds. So the AUC on the left shows how good we are in true positive versus false positives, and the graph on the right shows how calibrated these algorithms were. So the closer to the ideal line in the middle, the better and the more calibrated the algorithms. And then here we try to understand what are the most predictive features using these machine learning models. We were able to do this by, as example, random forest that we used that can give us the importance of these features. And we could find that the post-procedural state finding, as example, was one of the features, and essential hypertension, abdominal aortic aneurysm, hyperlipidemia, type 2 diabetes without complications, and other. So these are ranked, as you can see, according to the length of the blue chart. And then here we report the comparison between the logistic regression of the traditional risk factors, the random forest, which was using the electronic health records data, and the deep learning algorithm. As we can see, the deep learning was outperformed the rest by 0.96 in AUC, in average AUC. We can see that it had the highest sensitivity specificity, where sensitivity shows our ability to decide for a patient as a positive while he truly has the, in this case, the PAD disease. And this is in short this research, and I think we would have a question in the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Amal, for your presentation. With yours and like Professor Amir's insight, we can see how artificial intelligence and technology can have upsides as long as we consider and manage these downsides. And of course, last but certainly not least, we have Katriel Friedman, who will be talking about conceptual theories and perspectives in social and economic development. Take it away, Kat.
Thanks so much, Justin. Yeah, so specifically, I'll talk about what we call impact evaluation and its role in international development. But in more simple words, impact evaluation is testing what works. And what we're trying to do is help the global poor. So I'm going to tell a simplified story. I will be skipping over a lot of parts, and I'll be emphasizing different parts than other people might tell the story. So please be skeptical and be ready to ask some tough questions. The place I'd like to start is the reality that almost all people in poor countries have really hard lives. And I'm asking you this question: would you rather be rich in a poor country or poor in a rich country? Because I think if you haven't read about this, you will be surprised at how many people and how hard their lives are. The answer is usually that you'd rather be poor in a rich country, because as you can see in this graph, there is almost no overlap in the incomes between people who live in very poor countries and people who live in developed countries. It shows how many people have different levels of income in Denmark versus Ethiopia. And what you see is that almost everyone in Denmark is richer, a lot richer than the top 5% of Ethiopians. And when you go below that top 5%, very typical ordinary life in these countries is full of pain and sorrow. These are not remarkable photos. These are the kinds of things that I saw on a daily basis when I lived and worked in Kenya and India. And I was far from the places in either of those countries with the deepest poverty or the biggest challenges. Every time I went to a village where we had our team working, I would see kids with these stick-thin limbs, these swollen bellies that you get when you don't have enough to eat or enough protein to eat. Everyone I knew in Kenya had friends our own age who had died in motorcycle accidents or because of AIDS. That was just what it was like. So like you look at that, your heart bleeds and you think, let's just build some schools, some hospitals, teach people how to fish, maybe make regulations more friendly to generate jobs. But the problem is that poverty has been with us forever. In spite of constant renewed efforts and promises to address it. These are a few examples of those kinds of promises from the 20th century. In the 25 years after the end of World War II, most countries in Asia and Africa won their independence from the colonial empires. And there was tons of hope at the time that with freedom, you would see rapid development in the economy, in the governance, in the public services of these countries. Depending on the country, they had allies either in the East or in the West who worked to help them develop their economies and expand public services. But looking back, none of these countries became full-fledged developing countries with the only exceptions of Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. And sub-Saharan Africa in particular was a tragedy. A lot of countries became actually poorer per person from 1960 to 1990. The situation isn't quite as bad if you look at health or education and income, especially over the last 30 years. But no developing country saw improvements in health and education or any aspect of policy that were anywhere close to the kinds of improvements that we saw in South Korea and Taiwan. Having economic development makes all kinds of other improvements possible, and without it, they weren't. So at the dawn of the 21st century, you had to look around and say, gosh, whatever we're doing here to help the poor is simply not working that well. And there was a lot of soul searching in response to that. The idea that rightfully took hold was, let's test the projects we're investing in. Let's see what is actually working. And there are two big aspects to this revolution. The first aspect is, are we going to test things at all? And the second aspect was about the question, and how are we going to test the things that we do? So the language that we use in international development looks like this. Inputs are things that we add, drugs we buy, payments we make to teachers. Outputs are the immediate set of results that come from those inputs, more drugs being given out or teachers showing up to work more frequently. But what we really care about are often called outcomes or sometimes impact, which is where we get the word impact evaluation. Do kids attend school more? Do they learn more when they get to school? Do people get cured of diseases? In the past, serious people were always focused on measuring and reporting on inputs and outputs, but they often assumed that the outcomes would follow automatically. And that's what changed, was that assumption kind of went away or has been going away. And in the past, without actually checking, we never really learned what worked or what worked best, but now we can. And a couple of examples that I'll point to is, now, if you go back 10 years, there used to be a huge amount of enthusiasm for these microcredit programs. Grameen Bank with Mohammed Yunus won a Nobel Prize for these kinds of programs. People thought they would have a transformative effect on the lives of the poor, enable people to escape poverty. A big set of studies of 7 high-quality trials of microcredit programs in different countries found that they did have some benefits for allowing people to better manage their financial lives, but they didn't in a single country cause borrowers' incomes to increase on average. They didn't give people a pathway out of poverty. In the same token, there used to be a big debate about whether it was better to charge a small fee when you were distributing products like bed nets or water treatments or vitamins. But a whole bunch of impact evaluations found that these fees almost always really dramatically slowed down, excluded a good number of people. And so it's now standard policy not to include fees like that. So that's testing is obviously, it's a good idea to test things, and it's helped us learn some important lessons. The other issue is, how do you test in development? If you wanted to test a development project in the past, you might have looked at the participants beforehand, might have looked at the participants afterwards and said, okay, what kind of improvements do we see? The problem with the approach is that maybe you had nothing to do with the improvements. So imagine now that the people you are looking at, you also surveyed other people in the same communities, but who didn't receive the program, and their answers looked like this in orange. Clearly something got better, but also clearly you didn't really have anything to do with it. And economists and program evaluators have had much more sophisticated designs, which helped, but these study designs still suffered from more complicated versions of the same problem, or they could. And in the 80s, it became clear, some research came out that showed that the common techniques often gave the wrong answer in practical real-world situations. So people started concluding that the only kind of evidence we could really count on came from randomized experiments, like what are done to evaluate new medicines, which work by splitting up people into two different groups, randomly selecting who's going to be in the comparison group, who's going to be in the intervention group. And that means that at the start, these two groups have exactly the same kind of people. And if you see a difference between them at the end, it means that it must be because of what you did. If something happened, if there was any difference, if there's something happened at one group, it also happened to the other group. So it's only about what you the intervention that you actually carried out. As a result of this revolution, really, impact evaluation plays a bigger role every year in choosing development projects and in allocating funding, which is really great. There are still some open frontiers. Excuse me. If you start reading about this question, you'll see a lot of arguments about randomistas or micro approaches or for and against RCTs. I think it's a giant waste of time. I encourage you to tune that out. These are all incredible people who recognize that impact evaluations can answer many important questions, but also recognize that there are other important questions, perhaps even more important, that impact evaluations or RCTs can't necessarily answer. More substantively, one of the big frontiers is that in the world of impact evaluation, there's a lot less attention paid to how much programs cost to implement than what benefits they bring. This matters a lot because a program that costs twice as much can only do half the good if you have a fixed budget, if it accomplishes the same thing. And we're definitely in a situation where we have not close to enough funding to go around for all the good ideas out there. But still, when we evaluate projects, even when we do an impact evaluation, only about 20% of the time do we actually make an attempt to estimate cost per impact. When I say we, I mean the community in general. I should be very clear that I'm not articulating the views of my employer in any way. I think this costing problem is related to a fundamental mistake. In development, we're talking about people who are really in terrible situations and terrible in all kinds of ways. So you can fix one problem for some people, but they still have half a dozen related serious problems. And that means that even when you succeed, someone will always point at your work and say, well, that's good, but it's not enough. It's not enough just to pay people school fees. You need to also provide bicycles. You need to also train teachers. You need to also educate families about the value of education. And if you follow the advice of these people, you will end up with a program that'll be very expensive per beneficiary, and it'll probably be less impactful per dollar you spend. This is one of two things that people mean when they say it's not enough just to do X. I'm calling the ones I just talked about the haters, because I don't think it's a really valid argument when you're trying to choose. But there is a second thing that people say, which is sometimes true. Sometimes it is true that if you do X and Y together in a single community, they will build off of each other, and you'll get a bigger impact than if you do X in one place and Y in another place. I think this is actually rarer than people think. I just saw a seminar where the opposite was true, but it is something that people say, and it surely does happen some of the time. I still think because of this lack of clarity, when this complaint comes up a lot, and it comes up all the time, it would be very helpful for us to be more precise about whether we mean the good argument or the bad argument. So before I wrap up, I want to zoom out for just a second from international development. I really urge the attendees here to check out 80,000 hours. When I talk to people at a pivotal stage in their careers, and which includes every single high schooler and every single college student, I tell them to look at 80,000 hours. I really wish I had read something like this at age 16 instead of age 26 when I did discover it. You will make decisions you regret, I think, if you try to follow only your heart and only your intuition in your life. But if you treat your life as a puzzle and go out and answer your questions and consider alternatives, you'll have very good reason to be proud of your choices, and you will accomplish incredible things. I think there's no better guide than 80,000 hours for how to do that with respect to your career. So take a look, please. If it, like, I'd say take a pause right now. How can you actually make sure you'll read this thing? And if the best way you can do it is to sign off right now and just start reading it, like just start reading it. Okay, so thanks so much. And I guess we're over back to Justin for questions if there are any left.
Yeah, so I guess we can extend this until like 3:30. We just have a couple questions for each speaker. So we'll start with Oscar. We have a question about, is animal ethics impacted by geographical location? Do different countries in the world have different views towards the suffering of wild animals?
Okay, and the other question, you said there were two of them. So if you can read them both.
Yeah, so this first one is regarding the impact of geographical location. So do different countries in the world have different views towards the suffering of wild animals? And then another one is about the implications of technology in the mitigation of wild animal suffering, and what role you see technology playing in the future, and where improvements can be made.
Okay, well, so concerning the first one, that's not something that has been researched. So all I could say would just be based on anecdotal evidence. And on anecdotal evidence. And what happens is that, so working wild animal suffering is really recent. So 10 years ago, this wasn't a field. And as such, today is not really an academic field yet. It's something that we are building. And so, available evidence is very scarce. We could just consider animal advocacy in general to somehow extrapolate to this. And concerning that, you could say that, well, in recent years, maybe for the last 10 to 15 years, there have been some places like, for instance, Southern Europe and Latin America, where animal advocacy has grown really a lot. So much faster than, for instance, in Northern Europe or in the US and other places. And as a result of this, there is a lot of interest in these areas about new ideas that is less easy to find among animal advocates in places where animal advocacy is more established, like I said before, the US or Northern Europe. Now, when it comes to scientific interest, also it's very difficult to estimate really, and there is some distortion here because most efforts by advocates promoting research have been directed towards top universities, or at least universities in the US and good universities in Europe. So yeah, I'm sorry I can't come up with a clear answer to that. And as for the second question, well, even if we just apply the technology we have right now, we could make a more significant difference if we really have the will to do it, because there are ways in which we can already help animals. And the best examples of this have to do probably with wild animal vaccination programs, and also, you know, the use of contraception. Now, new technologies in the future, they may be useful to for instance, do better wild animal welfare assessments. On the other hand, there is a risk that because, you know, new technologies will help us to harm animals in growingly more sophisticated and harmful ways. And because our scientific development is not really accompanied by a parallel moral development, there is a difference that is ever growing there. We don't have reasons to be especially optimistic about new technologies, even if they have the potential to help animals in general, be them wild animals or domesticated animals. It's probably less likely that this will happen rather than with new technologies we'll be able to harm them more. So yeah, I think I haven't really replied the questions as those who ask them would want to, but I'm sorry, I just said what I could.
Yeah, thank you so much. So next for Professor Amir, we have a question about how do you feel about implementing open source work within your research into reducing biases? Is it a viable path, or should we avoid the idea altogether?
So I just want to say that my work is research work, and therefore we tend to be very open with our implementations. Indeed, conferences now almost always require, well, they don't explicitly require, but it is a factor that is considered whether your findings are reproducible. So it is in our best interest to provide implementations of the models we propose, because that will enable others to kind of validate and try to reproduce our results and even build on top of those. So I guess, yes, our implementations tend to be open source. The data that we use, it's different. For example, medical data, for example, there is a scarcity of large data sets of clinical data for obvious reasons, because they contain personal patient information. And so if you have data that is proprietary, it can be difficult to share. Most of the research that we do in clinic and LP is using a data set called MIMIC that is made somewhat publicly available, but not everybody can just go and download it. You have to do a training and then apply, and so there's some sort of a control in terms of who can has access that data.
Okay, yeah, I think that answers the question. Thank you so much. And then now for Heather, someone asked, I found the improvement for the packet eye drops to be a very interesting innovation. And they were wondering, is there a way to increase patient compliance with those eye drops? And is there improvements to comfort that can be made?
I think there are improvements to comfort for sure, because we can take drugs that would normally have to be in a very acidic solution, for example, and put them into these and put them in a pH balanced solution that would be comfortable on the eye. Compliance, unfortunately, is very much a patient thing. But one of the things that we think is that even with these eye drops, if we do a once a day requirement and the patient forgets the odd time, they're a little more forgiving. So for example, if you're supposed to take your eye drops every day, but you forget a couple days a week, it's okay, because there's still medication there and your condition is still being managed.
Thank you so much. And next for Saeed, Amal, someone is asking, what are you hoping for your technologies to be in the future and like sort of 5 years, and what you're hoping for the current workforce to bring to this research?
You're muted.
First of, yeah. So, well, first of all, my let's say my vision is to be able to take each one of these algorithms and models that research that we work on, and to be able to have it in working in hospitals, so it's kind of translated to real world settings where patients can use it. Specifically, this research that that I presented, it was in Stanford, and it's soon going to be deployed in the Epic system, where surgeons can already start using it, and where we can show you know, the risk score of the patient to have this disease. And this is my like I choose cardiovascular disease because it affects millions of people, and definitely these algorithms and research can help in saving their lives and make their lifestyle better.
Thank you. I think that definitely answers the question. And lastly, for Kat, we just have a question about, how does the West honestly view the African continent in terms of global development?
Can you repeat the question again? I missed a keyword, sorry.
Yes. How does the West honestly view the African continent in terms of global development?
I mean, the West is not a monolith, neither in terms of the countries that make it up, nor in terms of within each country, sort of who we're talking about. I think I don't think that I particularly have the finger on the pulse of how anyone other than myself thinks about anything. So I'm going to have an unsatisfactory answer to this question. But I think a general truth in the world is that most people who don't pay very close attention to a given place or a given community tend to have an idea that's 10 or 15 years out of date about how things are going in that place or in that community. Africa saw, starting in, I think around 2000, a lot of countries growing very quickly suddenly. I think things have slowed down a little bit in the last 5 or 10 years. But so I think the sort of typical person in the West doesn't even know that. It's certainly, when I lived in Kenya in 2014, 2015, you saw a lot of change on the street just over the course of a year or two. But it's still, I guess here's the big thing, right? Like, broader than just Africa, there used to be a really clear divide between rich countries and poor countries, developed countries and developing countries. And I use that same language in my presentation, but the truth is that that's no longer true. That there's now a broad curve of how rich countries are, and the most common type of country is somewhere in the middle. Over.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. So I guess that's the end of the Q&A. If you have any other questions, I guess you could email them if they're the speakers, if they're okay with that. But thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Hopefully you learned a lot, both for the participants and our speakers. And this shows how like many different fields can all intersect and interact. So feel free to email us, scholarsforsociety@gmail.com, with any questions or feedback, and we will also send out a recording of our webinar, and you can check out our website at scholarsforsociety.org. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks to everyone who came.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thanks so much for hosting. This was great.